Sounds good. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining the Colorado Sun's panel on fixing Colorado's mountain lifeline, dreams for a better future on I-70. People have suggested a shorter version of this might be I-70, what's wrong with you? Thanks to our sponsors, AAA of Colorado and to Mustang Transit Services across the state. Our journalism is made possible by them and by you, our readers and members, and we appreciate you being here tonight. I-70 at Glenwood Canyon was shut down entirely for 2 weeks at the beginning of August last year after mudslides that followed previous year's wildfires and wasn't fully operational until Thanksgiving. That is highly likely to happen again this year or next. 1 million cars a month pass through Eisenhower Tunnel. 1 million vehicles, many of them are trucks, important commerce and transit across the state of Colorado and throughout the West. Traffic counts at the tunnel have gone from 10 million a year in 2000 to 13 million in the year before the pandemic. We need more emergency routes for those wildfires that are growing and spreading across the state and happening more frequently. Given the blockages in Glenwood Canyon, we need more emergency routes as well to back those up. We're now talking about spending $2 to $3 billion on a front range train. We're not sure people will ride it. How far would that money get us in the mountains along I-70 for solutions there? People are stuck for hours on busy ski and hiking weekends year round. And that's not just vacationers. We got to remember that it's people who need to get to their jobs along I-70. It's people who are doing their jobs on I-70 by driving trucks, bringing commerce throughout the West and across the entire country, and supporting the supply chain. Is there help on the way? Have we given up on a grand solution? Do we have a failure of imagination, I-70? Have we given up on the big ideas that could make big improvements through the mountains? So we have a panel of great 3 people tonight to help us get through these questions, answer your questions. We hope that you will add your questions to the Q&A panel and they'll be relayed to us and we'll relay them to our panelists. Shoshana Liu is head of the Colorado Department of Transportation. The billion-dollar projects must go through her desk, must at least stop on her desk before she passes them on for consideration elsewhere. She's also helped push for a new set of rules that require CDOT to not just think about getting more cars and more pavement in Colorado, but how to help reduce overall pollution in Colorado before a big project can move forward. Tamara Pogue is one of the commissioners of Summit County. the big heart of skiing in North America and the crossroads of traffic heading east, west, and north and south. When Glenwood Canyon is cut off, more trucks and tourists divert onto smaller Summit County roads to get back on track through neighborhoods that Pogue represents. Ian Tafoya is the Colorado leader for Green Latinos and has been a strong voice for pollution controls and public projects that begin to repair some of the historic damage done to Colorado's low-income and high-minority neighborhoods. Tafoya has been heavily involved in the new CDOT greenhouse gas rules and also in the debate over Central I-70's disproportionate assault on neighbors in North Denver and Adams County. He is co-chair of the Colorado Environmental Justice Action Task Force. As our audience thinks of questions, remember to put them in the Q&A and we'll relay them. Thank you all for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. So the first question for Shoshana, would like each of you to talk about it though too, is to talk about what is your most vivid example that I-70 from Denver to the west is not working for the people you represent?
Well, that's a hard question to ask the CDOT director to pick just one. But I'll point to an anecdote that for me is kind of evocative of some of the themes that you just discussed. And you mentioned the rule that the Transportation Commission passed at the end of last year, doing a kind of first of its kind in the nation policy to hold agencies like ourselves accountable for the greenhouse gas pollution impacts of infrastructure projects. The timing when that rule was supposed to be proposed was exactly the week that Glenwood Canyon closed this past summer because of the devastating mudslides. We had a conversation, as people do in government, about whether you do a second big thing on a week when the first big thing has already happened. And we paused to think, can we manage the comms and the throughput? And we said to ourselves, we absolutely have to, right? These things aren't a coincidence, and it's not just that we will go with the schedule; we have to go with the schedule. So I think for me, the confluence of the timing of working on that policy with watching, what was happening in that place that affected so many people's lives across more corners of the state than you would possibly imagine, one anchor could impact, just drove home in a way that was very visceral what we're dealing with when we talk about resiliency and when we talk about the impact that a changing climate can have on the assets that make it possible for people to move.
Tamara, what's your most vivid example? And you probably hear from constituents all the time, and also people in Denver, about what's going on I-70 that impacts so many people.
I think like Commissioner Liu, I can't land on just one. So I have a couple of personal stories and then a couple of statistics that I think are pretty sobering. So 2 weeks ago, I'm a mom. I have 3 kids. It's my most important job. My oldest missed a day of school because I physically could not get her from my house in Dillon Valley to the middle school. 70 was closed and the congestion was so bad that every other major artery in Summit County was also closed. My personal record for the longest that I've sat on I-70 is 7 hours and 36 minutes from Denver to Summit County. But I think more importantly, the impact to the entire state from the closures has been estimated to be almost $1 billion every year. That is a staggering economic impact. And I'll also share one more. I'm a governing board member of the I-70 Coalition, which is a coalition of a nonprofit that's a coalition of local governments that advocates for necessary changes to I-70. And a notable 67% of panel respondents, users of I-70, reported that the frequency of their skiing and snowboarding had been reduced because of I-70 congestion. So I think both for the locals that I represent and for the entire state, this is a major issue that we have to tackle.
That's a big number, 67% of people changing their plans in a way that affects other people's jobs, other people's livelihoods, their own enjoyment, their own work. So that's important to remember. So let's return to that later on. Ian Tafoya, what's your best example? Can you top 7 hours and 36 minutes? Do you have other examples of where you think I-70 might not be working for the things that you're involved in?
Well, there are some examples where I do think it is working. Myself, I just got to take a bus from Vail on the bus staying, no problems, didn't sit in traffic, got my work done. And that was with the capacity that exists on it now. The closure of the Glenwood Canyon was detrimental to Latino communities in particular that live down valley in the Roaring Fork Valley. When you see a decrease in the overall economy, that impacts these people who work the jobs there, of course. And then I've had a lot of conversations with Clear Creek communities, in particular the commissioners there, about the impacts of the diesel pollution on their communities. There's so much the same about frontline communities that are within 2,000 feet of a highway. And with this amount of truck traffic on there, regardless if we widen it or smaller it, it is impacting the health of people who live right on the fence. And that's not even the noise pollution as well.
Shoshana, when Pete Buttigieg, the U.S. Transportation Secretary, was here and a few different stops along I-70, you went further west. What did you hear from people? What did you hear from him in terms of the problems and potential solutions on the way?
Well, we were thrilled that we were able to get the secretary out here to sort of see the I-70 corridor, among other things. And part of what we were very mindful of in designing the itinerary that he took was to see the places where I-70 pulls you into the Front Range, and also to see the dynamics of the communities further west, and particularly in the area around the Roaring Fork Valley. One of the kind of neat experiences that we all had during that trip is we worked very hard to get him onto a RAFTA bus. And it was something where we wanted him to see that the kind of phenomenon of what a highly transit motivated community looks like is not the same in Colorado as it would be in other parts of the country, and that there's huge potential to really have communities that are much more diverse than people probably think of when they sort of think of ski towns, utilize transit to move to and fro between the kinds of places where people work, live, and recreate in the way that they do on those buses. So we highlighted Glenwood Springs because of the obvious connection to the canyon and the work that we had done with folks at USDOT and the resiliency efforts, but really getting him on that bus to be able to see the cross section of people who, commute together on that highly utilized BRT corridor, which I believe is the only mountain rural BRT corridor in the country. I think really gave them an insight into the promise here in Colorado for helping to provide more choices.
Can we talk a little bit about the biggest project that's going on right now west of Denver, which will be Floyd Hill? And Pete Buttigieg made a stop there as well. You have big plans. The department has big plans for trying to improve the traffic, that choke point that people call the pinch through there. Walk people through some of the bigger elements of that and how that might improve work trips and ski trips 5 years from now.
So Floyd Hill is a fascinating project because it is tackling so many different things, and in a way that I think as a package highlights a lot of the areas where we're thinking deeply about how to innovate as we design more environmentally sensitive highway projects. At its core, the project on Floyd Hill will fix that pinch point. It will also replace badly deteriorating bridge structures. I mean, the spot where we were with the secretary, a week later, there was a pothole that formed that literally left a visible hole in the bridge right above where we were standing. I mean, there's not a lot of shelf life left on that bridge if we don't do something about it. So it combines that critical asset management project to take a very complicated piece of our bad bridge inventory with fixing the choke point so that you get the safety benefit of kind of streamlining it to the 3-lane configuration. We don't even think of it as a full expansion project because it functions as a 3-lane highway already. And then adding that managed lane structure to expand the managed lane network. Importantly, as we started to ask ourselves the questions, and really this comes out of years of the context-sensitive solutions process that we've worked through with folks like Tamara's Coalition to think about how you treat this as the environmentally sensitive area that it is. There's extensive wildlife protection features that are part of the project. There's multimodal improvements to the recreation paths. And importantly, we're starting and we're about to initiate a new transit service called Pegasus, which will complement our Mustang family with small shuttles that are designed to be a size where they can go in those shoulder lanes that exist near Idaho Springs right now. So what this will do, and we're intentionally starting the service before even construction starts, so that by the time the highway is done, our hope, and I think we will, we are fairly confident that this will be very popular, so that as we think about how to offset the potential vehicular miles traveled impacts that can come with highway projects, we're trying to get people used to an exciting choice so that will be very popular by the time the project is done. Those are just some of the highlights of the project. There's a lot more to it.
And Pegasus, do you have a month or a week that Pegasus do you have the vehicles? Do you have the drivers? Is everything going to be ready to go?
So we lost a couple weeks to the supply chain, like so many folks, but right now we're aiming to have it up and running by around Memorial Day. The goal is to have it launched by the holiday weekend.
Okay. Tamara, is Pegasus something that your constituents can use or looking forward to? Do they talk about it?
We are really excited in Summit County, and I think many other mountain communities are excited about Pegasus. We are certainly excited about Bustang. We hope that everyone, not just my constituents, but across the state will really consider the viability of changing the way that they get to the mountains and down to the mountains. And Bustang and Pegasus are major improvements in making it easy for folks to make that change to a new way of thinking about 70. I think as local governments, the challenge is how do we do our part, like RAFTA and like the Summit Stage in Summit County, to make sure that there is appropriate and easy and convenient and, in our case, free connectivity from those points that are served by Bustang and Pegasus. So we are really focused on that in Summit County, and I know other communities are as well. And one of the major challenges that we have is CDL drivers, and how are we going to provide enough staff support as we change to this new multimodal transportation mechanism, I guess is what I would say. So we are hoping that certainly the state and local governments can partner to really try and expand the capacity so that these generally can become major infrastructure that folks rely on.
And you're going to need to create hubs, right, to have things like Pegasus and Bustang mix in with Summit Stage and other local buses and other local transit services.
Yep, that's right. In Summit County, we are currently upgrading our transportation hub, I guess you'd call it, in Frisco. And I think, as funds from SB 260, which passed the legislature last year, as funds from the bipartisan federal infrastructure bill roll out, we'll certainly look at other connectivity points that we know we need to add.
Ian, is this kind of growth of a state-run transit service that now goes, there's really a spider web. You look at the map, it's pretty remarkable of how Bustang in the winter Snowstang is going to a lot of different corners of the state. I'm not sure people know that who haven't used it themselves. Now you'll have a smaller bus service that will run more frequently and make more stops. Are these the kinds of things that you're looking for and the environmental community is looking for?
Well, I think we're incredibly excited about Bustang. Actually had a chance to testify on a bill today about increasing funding to make that happen. Green Latinos has been on a 20-city tour. We're 16 cities down around the state of Colorado. It's called the Take on Toxics Tour. And a part of that is having a conversation with people about the emissions that come from our transportation sector. Absolutely. The thing about RAFTA, and this is interesting with Pete Buttigieg being here, is that a lot of the people who use that are forced to use that. They actually commute 2 hours a day into the Grand Valley. Why? Because of zoning restrictions in Up Valley. And so you have low-income people who are uncompensated riding the bus. And so it's absolutely a necessity. I was in San Luis Valley, for example, in the town of San Luis, and they're saying it's already hard enough to get to Alamosa. So I think smaller systems that allow those connections are incredibly important. I actually had a conversation with a CDOT representative after I returned on my trip from Vail saying we need maps, I think, that show the interregional connection that layers on top of it so you can get rid of some of people's range anxiety. Having really good hubs is incredibly important. We need to bring dignity to riding the bus back, where you're out of the elements, where you have access to power. We need to make it so that you are a rock star if you're doing the right thing for the environment and you're doing the right thing for safety. I think the things that's disheartening is that we're choosing to construct a road in which the buses can't go. And so we have to come up with this smaller system. The preferred alternative talked about a fixed guideway system, advanced guideway system a long time ago. And I think this vision of smaller buses is great, but we know how many people want to go up that corridor, and we know we need to find solutions that can move more than 15 people at a time. But I'm not going to knock any system that's trying to make an effort at it from an environmental standpoint, from a fairness. And you know what? I met some of my best friends on a party bus to Red Rocks. So I think that there's a huge opportunity for socialization that's deeply important about the mixing of people. Now, when we build these transit hubs, I think we also have to have a real conversation about who is it equitable and accessible to. As we see 700 people arrested at the Denver Union Station, we're having real conversation about what is actually accessible to the people and what is funded by the people. And so, housing crisis and homelessness is shared across the state of Colorado. I've learned that in my travels across the state. And so these are real concerns and questions we're going to have to answer when you talk about access to sanitation and water in these public spaces.
So you mentioned a lot of things I'd like to return to, but a couple of things at the beginning of that, you were part of that conversation, had to do with the extra lanes and the fact that Floyd Hill will get a new lane to the west but it's not a full lane. So Shoshana, this is a great chance for you to explain to a lot of people what the difference is between the lanes that have been built, the kind of zip lanes, why they can't run a full Mustang, the big bus, what the federal rules are on they can't be open all the time, and how that fits into how frustrating is that for what you guys want to do, and is it enough still to make a difference even the way we have to do it?
Well, the Floyd Hill project is going to be a standard size managed lane, so it will be similar to the US 36 managed lane. The zip lanes that exist now, we call them the peak period shoulder lanes, were a way to manage limited space in a way that utilized a federal flexibility. Essentially, we got special permission from the federal government, and because of the collaboration with the local partners, we're able to get limited approval to run basically the shoulder lane as a managed lane in peak periods only on weekends. That's a very important detail because Clear Creek County especially has been very adamant that they do not want that to function as a full lane all the time. And under the federal rules, we're operating under an exception anyway. But that's sort of part of how that scenario came into play. They do offer a faster alternative during the periods when demand is highest. At the same time, I think the fact that they're sort of flex lanes keeps a lot of the character of the corridor in a way that's comfortable for the folks who live and work there. The fact that they're not big enough for a full bus to run through, one sometimes deals with perfect being the enemy of the good. And, I think that to Ian's point, it would be a great problem to have our service overwhelmed quickly. I mean, in some ways, nothing would make me happier in this project than to need to figure out how to quickly scale it up because it's just so overwhelmed with demand. And, I think part of the theory of the case that we are operating on right now is to do the thing that we can do in a relatively short period of time to seize a moment where we think that demand exists. We were talking a little bit about some of the eye-popping statistics before. One of my favorites is that the Mustang West line is at 136% of pre-COVID ridership right now. At a time when people are talking about the struggles that transit is having nationwide, getting back to anywhere close to pre-COVID levels, that to me says that there is pent-up demand here and we have to act now in order to be able to sort of seize that as people are adjusting to the post-COVID environment. And the bill that Ian mentioned that's pending in the legislature is a huge deal because if those resources come through, what it will enable us to do is very quickly scale up service on both I-70 and I-25 to add a level of frequency that turns a service that right now doesn't necessarily serve commuters as well as it could to being able to connect into services like the Summit Stage and RAFTA to connect the dots and allow people to do these commutes that are very hard, right? It's not ideal that people have to commute as far as they do because of the housing prices and where the jobs are relative to the housing stock. But if that's the way that people are living right now, being able to kind of quickly adapt to make that lifestyle as easy as possible for them so that they can get the time back is, I think, really important. So is it perfect to your original question? No, but the opportunity that we have to really do something cool with the resources that we have, I think is quite tremendous.
Are people surprised? Yeah, go ahead. Ian.
If you wouldn't mind, I think I've seen some statistics that talk about for the $700 million that we would put into the induced demand that is likely to happen here on this highway, we could build 15 Mustang lines. We could be extending the lines that people want to see, like if you're in Paonia, getting that extra branch to Delta because they feel disconnected, or a bus from Pagosa to Durango, right? So, we've continued to spend billions of dollars on highway widenings, and that's not even talking about how the products themselves, the asphalt, the concrete, they're made in our communities. And so the impacts are very real. And it's great that we're passing this bill, but I do think that we need to be rethinking our 10-year projects to really be analyzing what the demand is, and that demand is for people to have regional interconnectivity with the rising cost of gas, and not everyone is going to be able to electrify at the same time. And if they do, bikes and some of these other last mile solutions are probably the best way to spend our money to get more of those into the hands of people. And so, induced demand is a real thing. And I know you mentioned it earlier in your opening. You build it and they will be full. I grew up in T-Rex. I still live in them needing to redesign I-25 over and over again. So I feel like unless we double down and invest more than what is in this bill, and we reallocate the resources that we've been contemplating. And, I get it. Safety of bridges is possible without spending $700 million.
So let Shoshana jump back in on that, because I think some environmental groups have presented it as an either or, that you could either do the Floyd Hill project or create a bunch of new bus lines. And as I understand it, Shoshana, the bridge and that huge flyway needs to be replaced no matter what. And that's a big chunk of the money. So it's not complete freedom with what happens with that 700 million, but feel free to fill in on any of the other things that he mentioned.
That's correct. Look, I don't disagree that everything is a trade-off when dollars are finite. But I think, in thinking about how we picked Floyd Hill as the capacity project that we're moving forward with right now, one of a handful. Part of the business case for that one is because in our view, the demand case is so clear already, and it is combined with this very significant asset management need where the replacement does, to your point, have to happen regardless. I think it's not going to be a T-Rex-like project in the way that it looks or feels, and that's a very important distinction to make. What we're talking about is a managed lane that streamlines with what exists on both sides, and looks like the mountain corridor that it is throughout, and was designed in a way that was very different than a road like T-Rex was designed. I think that I've mentioned the context-sensitive solutions process because I think, as we think about how we've built the case for different kinds of conversations around highways, that to me is one of the most significant changes that's happened historically at CDOT in working with the communities along the I-70 corridor, because neither that project nor Glenwood Canyon nor so many others were designed to just kind of build a freeway through beautiful places. So I just want to make a point on those distinctions. But, I also appreciate that it is true that a dollar that you're spending on one thing is a dollar that you're not spending on something else. But it's not, again, $700 million it's going to just doing highway expansion.
I want to
Tomorrow,
interject and maybe
county.
make the so I want to make the case for both, actually. One of the things that's happening right now that most folks will never even know is happening are sort of safety and technological upgrades to the Eisenhower Tunnel, which from a Summit County perspective, we're absolutely grateful for. A few weeks ago, we had a situation where I-70 was closed up, the approach up to the tunnel was a complete mess. And our first responders couldn't get up there for a public safety need, right? So the infrastructure piece of I-70 is critical. It can't be ignored. It's not just about Floyd Hill. We've been trying to get exit 205 on the 10-year list, as Shoshana knows, for years in Summit County. It's a major frustration for us. And the reason it's frustration is because you take all these people and you gradually push them down and down and down into smaller exits. And then you push them into communities like Summit County that were built for populations of 30,000, but regularly have 250,000 in them. And the system just doesn't work. So there's a real need for infrastructure improvements. But the bottom line is, you can keep building lanes, you can keep adding capacity as much as you want, but there'll never be enough money to really continue to address the growth that we're seeing in our state. And so we do also need to heavily invest in some of these other multimodal approaches, to Ian's point, because you can't just keep putting people in the same way on the same road that you always have when you have no capacity to grow to meet the growing demands of our community. So this is, from a mountain community perspective, this is absolutely a both. And it's going to take leadership and vision to actually move the needle on some of these challenges.
Tell us more about exit 205 briefly. What's there and what needs to change?
So exit 205 is the exit that folks know, the first exit through the tunnel into Summit County. And, the real problem is you have a very steep decline and a lot of cars that then begin to back up as they try to get on or off I-70. And it is an increasingly dangerous situation because folks don't always realize that the car right in front of them has stopped. They slam on their brakes, they swerve. We're seeing increasing, public safety problems. That's compounded by the fact that, as we all know, this is also a major economic transportation route. And so those semis come down I-70 and their brakes light on fire, right? And so that compounds some of those public safety issues that I just talked about, but it's also a huge wildfire risk for our mountain communities. And so there's, a number of changes and improvements that need to be made, both on the approach down and then as people exit and enter really onto 70 from that exit. And, 203, which is Frisco, has the same problem. That one has been on the list, and certainly appreciative of the fact that we know that the needs and upgrades to that exit are going to happen.
Can I
Sure,
ask a
Sean, what are
question,
those on the list?
Commissioner? Can I ask a question, Commissioner?
Yeah, go
How
ahead.
is it, how is the grade of the roads won't change, so the wildfire risk stays the same no matter what, does it not?
No, because I think there are ways that we can increase what I would call the mitigation opportunities when semis do lose their brakes coming down. You've seen that on Vail Pass, for example, all the upgrades that have been made to those semi exits, or I can't blanking on what the actual technical name is, right? But the more that we can do to provide places where those semis can have a safe place to exit, the safer it then becomes for everybody else.
Right. Like one of the key aspects of the big project that's happening right now in Vail Pass is that we just added a runaway truck ramp.
Yes.
And there's several of those throughout the corridor, and it's an area where we know that a lot of improvement is necessary, both for the safety of the trucks if they lose control of the brakes, but absolutely because truck fires are an incredibly dangerous thing for many reasons, which just worsen with the increased wildfire risk. Can I touch briefly on the kind of yes and concept of trying to do both? I think, first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with that point, but I also think that one of the most practical ways to do that is to quickly enhance the routes that we have that utilize the corridor, because, the infrastructure is hard to take care of, right? Running an interstate through a mountain access like I-70 is just difficult, right? There's multiple points where it's amongst the most intricate parts of the interstate system as a whole, and, they aren't jewels of the interstate for nothing, and that makes them hard to take care of. But it also means that once we are doing the things that you have to do to keep a road like I-70 safe, making sure that we leverage that space in a multimodal way as quickly as possible, I think it's the fastest thing that we can do to be able to do both at once. And at some level, just making sure that the service is sufficient to both satisfy the demand that exists and also, to use it differently, induce new demand by making it more usable for people who need it day to day, I think is something that is imminent and needed.
So Shoshana, I think we keep hearing that the roads will fill up sooner or later. Question, how soon it can be debated, but we also keep talking about the need of multimodal and alternatives. Are people surprised when you talk to them and they see the budget request that CDOT, that the state of Colorado has become such a huge transit operator itself all throughout the state, and that with this request in front of the legislature right now, it would get a lot bigger. We have a governor who some people say has a strong libertarian streak, and yet CDOT is managing a large public transit network.
One of the things I've been very enthused by is how resounding the support for that bill has been. I mean, it was something that we worked on over the last several months, and frankly, it was a proposal that came out of a need that was expressed by so many of our local partners. We've been hearing just again and again, and particularly in these months as we've been sort of figuring out what the new normal is, both from the Summit County part of the corridor and the folks in the kind of area in and around Glenwood Springs and the Roaring Fork Valley, that the thing that they need is a connector between the local services. So, the origin of that idea was hearing from our partners on the ground that there was a gap that needed to be filled, and just trying to sort of find a straight line to fill it quickly. It's received bipartisan support, which has been, I think pretty cool because it's solving a real problem. And, I think 10 years ago, it probably would have surprised people. I think right now the business case for it is in some ways so intuitive that it's, it's a little bit of an aha.
Okay. Ian, how do you feel the state is doing as a major transit operator right now and growing bigger, especially if the bill is passed?
Well, I think the backbone that they've built out is incredibly important. And even through the greenhouse gas mitigation, and we talk about scoring projects, I've had conversations with Shoshana about how do we start building the backbone, let's say to Weld County and some of these other places where we know the population growth is taking place. I think we continue to hear the same thing again. It doesn't always run in the directions that people want at the right times. We know that when it comes to transportation, it comes down to headway times and whether it's realistic for you. The best sections, as I see them now, of course, are back and forth to Vail, where there's this need for money to be made, right? Because people are going up there and they're skiing and it's tax revenue based and it's good and we have tourists. But, going out to Grand Junction, I heard a story recently where because they don't have a system in place where you can necessarily reserve a ticket and it only really leaves a couple times, sometimes people get stuck and they're not able to get all the way in which they were planning on. And in this particular case, it was a friend of mine who is a flight attendant. So she ended up flying to Grand Junction instead of taking a bus because she waited and it didn't work out for her. I heard you say earlier about whether people would ride a train or not. I think it's on the Front Range. I think it's absolutely true they would. And when I was in Trinidad just a couple of weeks ago, people were saying, gosh, I wish I could just take a bus or a train to the airport. It is having to go through multiple major cities. Traffic just adds on and makes more than a day of transportation for people. One place in particular from an equity standpoint that I really want to point out for people is the connections to the prisons and criminal justice. For those families in Denver whose people are incarcerated in Canyon City, Florence, Buena Vista, sometimes these projects are the only way in which it's affordable for people to visit their relatives. It's a large population commuting to work in these government prison sector jobs from Pueblo, so that's a greenhouse gas mitigation, but really it is an equity issue to get people connected. And for people in San Luis, $150 to be able to put gas in your car to go to Denver, or a $15 bus ride. And if we can make those connections for them, it's a win-win. We've been hearing about everyone's put money back in people's pocket. Lowering the cost of transportation while solving the climate crisis is a win for everyone. And this is something that the governor actually, and I don't always agree with the governor by any means, trains and transportation is something that I ran for city council here in Denver. And if you live here in Denver, it is a win-win for us to build a system nationwide because we are the hub. You get the most access. Advocate for the equity of others and gain for yourself, and it's something that we remain committed to working with Shoshana and others on.
So you named a lot of different constituencies that can and would use transit, in his opinion, and some of the statistics are proving out. Tamara, in your constituency, do the commissioners and do other local government officials have a role to play in making sure that these new opportunities are being used, that the buses do get filled, and that the support shows up with people in seats?
Before I answer that question, I just want to lift up one thing in particular that Ian said about the reservation issue on bus staying. That is a huge challenge for my constituents as well.
Okay.
From a standpoint of us folks that rely on these things to get to work and live our lives, and we're not on vacation, the ability to make reservations is really, really important. And so I do hope that that's something that can get addressed sooner rather than later. In terms of the role of local government, I think our role is connectivity. To Ian's other excellent point, folks aren't going to use multimodal unless it works for them. It gets them from where they need to be, when they need to be there. And we just made an incredibly difficult decision in Summit County. We had to move our Summit stage schedule this summer to an every hour pickup, where traditionally we've done an every 30-minute pickup. That's devastating for me because the impact it will have on our local workforce who rely on it to get to work, to get their kids to school. Our local transit right now is being used heavily by students because our district doesn't have CDL drivers, but we had to make the decision to go to every hour because we don't have CDL drivers either. And we can't hire folks because the cost of living in our mountain communities has gotten so exorbitantly high. And all of these things are compounding to make it virtually impossible. So that the economic power of I-70, to come back to that, is vital to our communities. But we feel like we've lost a bit of balance. So when, there are so many people who want to come enjoy our lovely community, and we're certainly grateful for them. But I get a little worried when we start talking about the train, for example, because it increases the capacity of folks to come up to the mountains. And that compounds a lot of our other challenges, like housing, like the ability of our kids to get to school. So, certainly local governments have a responsibility here. But in many cases, we're sort of left with what's left. And with the limited funds that we receive for transportation as local governments for road and bridge, it's really difficult to figure out how we balance all of these different competing priorities.
I just want to say, everybody who's listening, you can see the brain power we've got here. So put your questions in the Q&A and we'll try to relay them as we go. Shoshana, a couple of things come up there that I think you probably deserve a chance to address, since it came from two people on the panel. One is reservations, and is that something that is changing and people will be working on? and finding drivers. How did you find drivers? It's impossible for people in all kinds of commerce right now and public service to find drivers.
Well, first on the reservations, I totally agree with you, and I think one of the things that we're going to have to think about is, hopefully have the challenge of implementing the new bill, is how we make sure that the technology platforms work for people who are using it, not just for an occasional trip, but for their daily lives. And I think that goes hand in hand with having the kind of frequency that serves people who have jobs and not just people who are, taking a day trip or on a vacation. And I think that the idea behind how we would intend to implement the bill is to really start with the travel times that are most necessary for commuters, because that, I think is the first and foremost gap that we're solving for, knowing that it's a win-win for everyone if we can make a commuter schedule work. And that it's something we would love to have a immediate dialogue with folks across the corridor about, because I also think that integrating it with the platforms for the other transit providers is going to be important as well, and thinking about creative ways to make the kind of feel of a one-seat ride transpire across multiple jurisdictions. Look, the driver issue is a real issue in multiple parts of the sector, right? We encounter it with snowplow drivers as well, and also in the bus driver space. I guess a couple of thoughts on it. First, one of the benefits of trying these smaller vehicles is that the training to be able to drive a smaller vehicle is not actually CDL training. So if it proves effective, it may be a way for us to increase the set of skill sets that can help with moving people in multimodal ways. The other, though, is that I think that we've been very focused on the opportunity to sort of grow your own in the CDL space. We've hired a lot of folks in our snowplow operator ranks this winter who did not come to us with CDLs, and they started on jobs where they weren't doing the safety sensitive work and got their training and got to take the licensing exam through their work at CDOT. And it's good for them because it's a life skill that you can take anywhere these days, but it also is a way for us to build on a workforce where more succession planning is desperately needed. It doesn't solve everything immediately, but I think focusing not just on the fact that there's a problem, but how to intrigue people to join a field they might not have thought about, because it's so needed and has so many applications right now, is something where there's a lot of space for people in different corners to work together. And it's not going to get fixed overnight, but I do think that there's ways to rebrand CDL driving in ways that I think might appeal to newer workers as well. I mean, one of the things that we just did at CDOT is we're building a training program that includes simulators. So, for those who've trained on equipment, often you use it's kind of like a large scale video game that can help you practice driving on a computer. And it's both a very safe way to practice, but it's also, I think, a way to market the discipline to, kind of technology native generations in a way that, perhaps the kind of old vision of who would drive a truck wouldn't.
Ian, which of those things did you want to comment on?
Well, I want to comment on both. First of all, I want to say thank you to the essential workers, the bus drivers who put in the time to ensure that other essential workers were able to get to their jobs during the pandemic. We cannot thank you enough from working families for the work that you put in. And I feel very similar, because I was an educator before I was in politics, that professions like these need to be elevated. We need to find ways in which our government can subsidize and lift the wages of these individuals who are providing critical infrastructure jobs to our communities. It will help them be able to afford to live in these communities. And then I just wanted to address what the commissioner said about the loss of bridge funds. I agree with you. When I was fighting the Central I-70 project, which was expanding through my community, and we sued over it, the half of the Bridge Enterprise Fund for the next 30 years going to 2 miles in Denver was a mistake that took away from rural communities like yours who deserve safety and efficacy on these bridges. I just want to make clear that my community was united. We had billboards in Grand Junctions over this, right? That were donated because we understand that resources continue to be tapped to Denver, which isn't equitable to all Coloradans while also causing us harm.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
I'm sorry.
I just said I really appreciate that, Ian, because, in so many spaces, not just this particular transportation one, it is really challenging to watch so many resources go into the urban parts of the state, when in so many ways it's the rural and rural resort parts of the state that are making deep and meaningful contributions, not just to the state, but particularly to the economy of the state. So we need to find ways to make sure that all of our economies across the state, whether it's agriculture or tourism or anything else for that matter, have the opportunity and the infrastructure they need to thrive.
Okay, well, let's talk about pouring billions of new dollars into rural areas and west of the Denver metro area. Shoshana, is this a fair question? When do we
Sure
get our
thing.
monorail? Everybody's favorite Simpsons episode is the monorail episode. Are we thinking big enough about these solutions? Does anybody still talk about the possibility of a train or some other fixed guideway transit into the mountains?
No, look, I think it's absolutely still a live discussion, and that doing the things we can do now are not mutually exclusive with keeping the bigger dreams alive. And we're having a very similar conversation on the I-25 corridor, where the Front Range Rail conversation is very much active. We're doing the environmental studies, but it's still a long ways out in a best case scenario. At the same time, we're building rapid bus service into the expansions of I-25 so that we can start to build that transit demand in real time. And I think the best thing you can do to make a big infrastructure project real is to have the culture that will use it be there. So, in my view, again, to our earlier conversation, it would be a great problem to have to do these solutions that we're talking about right now and have them just be so, overrun with popularity that we needed to turn very quickly to the next steps. But I think that, I think that it only builds on each other in terms of creating, the prospect for more multimodality across the corridor.
Tamara, do you feel that something big is possible, is realistic, and is it something you hope for?
I always think something big is possible and realistic. I think where we're more focused in Summit County is on all of the small things that can build up together into something big. I think big feels a little scary in the mountains right now because there are just so many people up here that we don't have an infrastructure to support. And so what we would rather see is more investment in what I would call the small, more investment in busting, more investment in Pegasus, more investment in supporting and rebuilding the infrastructure we already have before we begin to talk about really expensive projects that, it's the fancy stuff before we have the basic stuff.
If I can quickly build on a real point that you articulated, I think really wonderfully about the small things building into big things. I can't agree with that statement enough in terms of the way that if we're sort of integrated and strategic about how we connect the small things, they can really magnify beyond the sum of their parts. And that, I think, is the case both on things like fixing rural roads. One of the things that we're most proud of in the 10-year plan is how many cumulative miles of rural roads are getting fixed because of it. It's increased by like 50% the number of rural road miles that get a serious treatment each season. And those projects are much more sort of fulsome than the ones that would happen under our standard asset management program. In a similar vein, the conversation we're having about transit right now started with us trying to work with all the local partners to just map out what already exists and what you would have to do to, connect them so that they could all be integrated with one another. And I think that, if we focus on how to make that system work as one system first, we'll be sort of impressed beyond what we may be expecting by just the results of doing that, because it's in some ways, it's just not that hard, right?
One reader asks Shoshana if we have ever requested funding for a specific fixed guideway between Denver and Vail.
Not to my knowledge in a kind of live conversation. We're talking about very large amounts of money if you were to actually build it. There have been studies, but to actually build it would require funding beyond what you would just get as a piece of a bigger plan, right? It's not something that's going to be a line item in the 10-year plan. It's something that would have to go to the voters with a very specific set of funding parameters and probably require formation of special districts and all of those kinds of things.
So, I want to give you a chance to talk about that. Talking about pouring billions and billions of dollars into one thing. Does that appeal to you? Is that something that we need in that corridor?
I lean incrementalist in terms of biting off the things we can chew first and showing that you can make a difference with the dollars we have. But that doesn't preclude, again, keeping the big visions alive. One of the things that defined the 10-year plan when we established it is that it was actually a much lower number than the previous CDOT list had been. And it doesn't mean that the projects that were on the $9 billion list weren't good projects. I hate to say it, I believe one of them may have been Exit 205. But what the exercise we went through was how many dollars do we have and what can we do to absolutely make the most of them and show that they achieve impact. And I sort of philosophically think that in order to get more resources, you have to show that you're making an impact that is what you said you were going to do with the ones you have. So I think that doing these small projects, which mean as much to small communities as a big project like Central 70 does to Denver, really shouldn't be underestimated in terms of how important they are, right? Like, one of the projects we're in the process of starting right now is the auxiliary lane that will be one of the things to help the 205 to 203 corridor. And, it's something that was also in the I-70 environmental impact statement and has been on the list for years and years. That will make a big difference in terms of traffic. Will it solve everything? Absolutely not. But, it will show what one tranche of investment can do, and it doesn't preclude the others being necessary, but there will be something to show for that having been done. So I think being able to do those small to medium-sized projects in a way where you show the beginning, middle, and end of them in a way that's clear, has a tremendous amount of value, both in impact and in creating trust in government.
Ian, Tafoya, what do you think of in terms of thinking big along those lines and pouring billions of dollars into one single project? Does that appeal to
Well,
you?
as I said, I have questions about the $700 million, but I am excited about the transportation solutions. I think when you go back and you look at what the record of decision said and the preferred alternative, I think one of the most important things we do is not construct the Floyd Hill in a way that would increase the cost long-term of adding upgrades like they're talking about. So if we can maintain the right-of-way that would be the right-of-way, knowing that it would be engineered the safest and the cheapest, for a fixed guideway system, I think that's important. I think the Front Range corridor equally is important. I'm really happy to see a bill moving to get that NEPA going. Like I said, from Pueblo to all these places, people have been talking about how important it is. But I think there's also a piece in here that people are maybe missing, and that is, at one point in time, I was the vice president of the Denver Parks Board. Denver alone owns 16,000 acres of mountain parks. You connect that with the Jefferson County open space, there are thousands and thousands of miles of trails that are not very accessible to transit now. Again, I campaigned on public transit to Red Rocks, the mountain parks, and as we've lowered costs for families by making kids passes free in some of the communities in Denver, I think some of that can also alleviate why people go up into the mountains, right? If you can access outdoor space without having to travel that far and we're able to message to people, we may be able to reduce some of those miles on there. And we may have less of the induced demand and less of the pollution on the road to begin with.
I want to stick with you for a minute to be the first one to talk about an electrification question that I have on my list, but we're also getting from viewers tonight. We haven't mentioned much that the way that we're going to be driving on all these new roads is going to change a lot in the next few years. It's already changing. We're selling, a good percentage of EVs. We now need to build the charging stations to handle all that all across the state. That needs to be done in an equitable way, and you're involved in that. Talk to us a little bit about your concerns. If you have things that you think are going well, that'd be great if you could mention those too. But as we electrify the state, what are your concerns about making sure it happens equitably?
Well, I mean, not everybody who's going to have an electric car is going to have a garage to do that on their own. So I think public charging stations are going to be incredibly important. I think as we start talking about rates that people pay for charging, it's very similar to the cost of gas. We're going to have to figure that out. It's a conversation I have with Senator Hickenlooper's office a lot. Green Latinos was the first environmental justice coalition to ever intervene at the AQCC for zero emission vehicles, and the first ever at the Public Utilities Commission for transportation electrification plans for Excel and the PUC. So there's a huge opportunities to make sure that these resources are available to our communities. It starts with outreach. There's huge changes coming to all these agencies. As you mentioned before, I'm on the Environmental Justice Task Force. SB 272, modernizing the PUC, has environmental justice components. SDB 260 created an environmental justice division inside CDOT where we can have these conversations, and we work closely, with the energy office. I think the other thing we have to start thinking about is how we're going to power it all and whether that's going to be equitable or not. Because in Colorado, Majority of the power plants are in Latino communities exclusively. I'm not saying that the communities are 100% Latino, but they certainly make up the majority of the people across the Front Range, across the state of Colorado from coal and gas plants. And we know that coal and gas cause problems all along the way for water pollution, truck traffic, pipeline leaks, and it's toxic. So we have to find ways in which we can power this in a clean manner that helps reduce the overall pollution load. Because what I hear about some of these fast charges is they're similar to 100 homes. And so if you have hundreds of homes turning on all at the same time, that may actually mean more point source pollution for the people living next to it. So I think we have to be thinking really big about that component. And I think there are really cool ways with bills that we're running right now for microgrids, community-based solars, ways in which we can store some of that. And in particular, you know, these mountain towns are kind of unique because with renewable energy on a grid and pumping water up and down over a dam, we may be in long-term solutions for hydropower that could help solve some of those solutions too.
Tamara, are your constituents demanding electrification? Are they demanding more chargers? What's your role in helping to provide those and making sure they get placed equally around the county and giving everybody equal access?
We've worked really hard to provide access around and at various points around our community and our county, and our municipalities have done the same. I will say, though, I get very concerned about what I would call the economic equity in this conversation. You know, in mountain towns, because so many of our jobs are low-wage service jobs for so many of our constituents, access to some of this technology is simply out of reach. And I am a strong proponent of there needing to be a larger conversation about those inequities. You know, when I start thinking about the electrification of vehicles, I mean, I couldn't afford a hybrid vehicle right now. There's no way. And I have so much more privilege than so many people in my community. We have to do a better job of finding ways to make sure that you know, your socioeconomic status does not prohibit you from contributing to the problem of climate change and resolving the problem of climate change. And I fear if we are not more deliberate about that right now, we're going to see even greater inequities in this space moving forward.
Commissioner, I think that comes down to some financial literacy. I think you probably could afford it. We've created a lot of programs. I think myself, I never thought I would. And now I'm in a Prius that I got for 11 grand and it saved me massive amounts of money. It's not a full electric. I was debating over range anxiety and I think I'm in that place. But one thing we've been talking so much about is just the financial literacy. There's so much money, so many programs, the utilities are bought in. We've had some leadership on the governor's administration and from the legislature in particular on this. And that may have been true in the past, but I think it's really possible. And we did focus grouping with some of the most low-income people in the highest territories like Black Hills Energy. And what they say is they want down payment assistance. And if we can get to a place with down payment assistance and financing, we can get there. And I'm happy to tell you there are some programs. We'd be happy to talk with you about them to see how you can get there. And the other thing is, and I know this is true in Summit County, you know, there are more than 640,000 monolingual Spanish speakers in Colorado. And we work with local governments to talk about how they can advance their language justice beyond just Spanish. For some communities, they're indigenous languages from Mexico, Burmese, you name it. There's all sorts of languages that are relevant for particular communities. So when I think financial literacy is going to be so huge here of breaking down this idea that this isn't for me and helping people realize how it can be.
I appreciate that. And I agree with you actually that down payment assistance is the answer to this challenge, right? We have to move away from tax credits to upfront financial assistance for folks. So absolutely agree with you there and would welcome any strategies you have that we may be able to incorporate into Summit County.
Shoshana, if you could talk a little bit about how much of this is in your inbox, if you were building a network that can be electrified, is electrified, yet how much worry is there that a large number of people won't be able to actually buy the electric cars and afford the regular charging that can get, you know, fairly expensive, maybe not as much as gas, but it does add up.
It's a highly multivariable problem with a lot of different players who have different roles in the transition. And, you know, from CDOT's perspective, figuring out, you know, how we fit into the picture of making EV access equitable, comfortable, and, you know, also equitable from a geographic perspective is sort of the piece of it that falls most squarely into the CDOT jurisdiction and the sort of associated enterprises that got set up as part of Senate Bill 260. Folks may recall that the transportation bill last year set up 3 new enterprises, one of which is sort of most focused on fleets, one of which is most focused on charging, and one on kind of equity and access. And those, I think, are some of the pillars that we need to be thinking about in contemplating how all these pieces fit together. The federal bill, for example, will push a large amount of the money through CDOT, and that's in part because the network between places is ours, right? And when I think about the kind of access problems from a geographic perspective, the question of how do you make rural electrification possible only works if you have subsidized charging in between the places where it will happen a little more naturally, right? It's not a stretch to think that there will be, multiple kinds of charging in downtown Vail pretty quickly. Will it be there in Kremlin? Probably not as fast. And part of what we can do as the custodians of the, long stretches that connect places is to make sure that there's, maybe not even the fastest charging, but there's a sort of last resort charging if you need it, pun intended, so that if you have a problem, there's a way that you can get a charge and get to your destination. One of the things that we're focused on right now is places like the byways, right? Places where people drive that are very beautiful, but they're also quite remote in a lot of places, and they're not going to be a hub once it gets commercialized like gas stations are now. I think another aspect of this is recognizing that places will electrify at different speeds, right? When we think about to the transit space, the buses in the mountains are not going to be the first ones to be electric, because just like a bus driving in the mountains uses more gas because of the elevation, the same thing effectively happens in the electrification space. So recognizing how we can use non-single occupancy vehicles to help lower the footprint along with the transition to electric vehicles as soon as it can possibly happen, I think all has to fit together. And that's one of the things that was sort of philosophically behind the GHG pollution reduction planning rule, was to make sure that there were all the pieces that we're doing for electrification, but that we also think about how we connect places through infrastructure and how those things fit together to complement in providing lots of ways to lower the footprint in the transportation space.
Okay, well, we've hit a lot of topics. I want to make sure readers have asked a couple of questions along the edges of the intersection of affordable housing issues with transportation issues and how people get around. And maybe one way to launch into that particular discussion is to ask Shoshana whether CDOT has ever had to consider, like other government agencies are all over the state, finding housing, helping workers find housing in order to make sure that you can land those bus drivers, those snowplow drivers, and make sure that they can get access to work and are close enough to actually do the job.
Absolutely. And it's a challenge that everybody is grappling with together, because in every sector that has critical workforce, you're running up against this problem right now. There are a couple of projects CDOT has actually done and started to experiment with this concept. We just finished a public-private partnership in Glenwood Springs where part of it was to use our right-of-way and add units of housing, some of which are reserved for our workers. We're in the process of working with Frisco to do a project that's very exciting and just got its kind of first approval from the Transportation Commission. So that's been years in the making, and will be a real improvement for many workers in the public sector. And we're looking at other places where we may be able to do that as well. There's sort of a long tradition in CDOT of having trailer housing in many of the maintenance facilities, and that's an awful lot of folks who've matriculated through our maintenance workforce have lived in those communities for a long time. So it's a space where what it looks like changes over time, but the challenge isn't new, though it has certainly reached a very critical point right now. I would also just tie it back to the transit conversation, where part of how we deal with getting our arms around this problem is to make sure that the transit connections exist where the housing is more possible, and doing what we can to anchor transit-oriented development, but also being realistic about where there are commutes that people are doing and providing those commuters with choices through transit.
Ian, you mentioned the long trips that people are taking in the Roaring Fork Valley to work. And is that also related to affordable housing? And is it just at some point become too complicated to work on all these huge issues at the same time?
Well, I find the Roaring Fork in particular really interesting, because Green Latinos has members that work in, say, land trusts, and then we have other community members who work in electrification of buildings. And there's this interesting dynamic at play between conservation easements effectively serving to restrict where you can zone and build, and that has caused people to live down valley. When I hear of projects that are in the right of way, I think it's great that CDOT's trying to find solutions for housing too. I really do. But I think modern day redlining in a lot of ways, we see this in Denver, is we know that the corridors with the highest traffic counts, if there's within 2,000 feet is the highest level of pollution. And so when we're adding density for low income individuals in areas that we know are not okay for public health, we're actually working against ourselves, and we end up paying for it on the back end, in particular when you think about some of the lowest income people are on Medicaid or Medicare. And so we are picking up that cost for the long-term health impacts, cardiovascular, lungs. So, I've been an advocate. I sit on a committee here in Denver around affordability, attainability, and we are trying to emphasize that we need to build them in places. And, Commissioner, I hear what you're saying about a train, because my mother's neighborhood was the first to get the A-line in Denver, and all it did was cause gentrification because we didn't have good tools in place like inclusionary housing or deep subsidization for people down to 40% AMI. And so we're trying to undo that now. But look, we as a community have had success. We've now created inclusionary housing. I'm looking forward to how that is implemented in your community. And right now, for example, there are revolving loan funds and different conversations happening for trailer park communities. And then what's unfortunate is the trailer park communities also suffer from really poor water quality. I've heard this all across the state of Colorado. So if you're paying a lot for transportation, you're double paying for water, so you have bottled water. There's a lot of ways I think we can lower costs for individuals in those communities, but we have to take it all on at the same time. Transportation is one of our biggest greenhouse gas emitters. We got to take it on. So are buildings. It's just a huge opportunity, I think, for us to construct and to build. And I have a wild idea of saying, I don't understand why we're not doubling down and building more out of beetle kill, because honestly, we need to be sequestering that carbon real fast.
Commissioner, do you want to talk about the connection between affordable housing and transit in your county and how you guys deal with it? Is it possible to make sure that where the places you do have available for affordable housing do have a way for those people to get to work?
Well, I could certainly opine on housing for probably the next 3 hours, but I will save the listeners from that. Every conversation in the mountains right now starts with housing. There is nothing, you cannot move a policy solution forward unless you are talking about access to affordable and attainable housing. So in Summit County, we certainly think about the connectivity of our, one of the major differences between urban communities and rural resort communities is that in rural and rural resort communities, government is largely the developer of affordable housing, whereas on the Front Range, you see more private developers playing that role. So for Summit County government, we've been building affordable housing for a long time. We will continue to build affordable housing as much as we can possibly afford to do. But yes, as we are thinking about the developments that we are moving forward, we definitely want to make sure that those units all have an ability to connect to the rest of the community, regardless of someone's own personal transportation status.
Thank you. I guess we have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to update people and let Shoshana update people on what's going on with Glenwood Canyon. We mentioned it a few times. We talk a lot about the roadway and how that was blocked, but what else was blocked was the river itself. Suffered quite a bit of damage. And Shoshana, you said there have been some recent developments and some recent finishing up some work within the river itself.
Never an evening talking about I-70 without Glenwood Canyon. It is certainly a challenging area where, again, to end where we started, the impacts of climate change are coming together in a very forceful and visible and impactful way. Over the last year, the coming together of different agencies, different actors, different areas of expertise to take care of that area has been pretty extraordinary. In the immediate aftermath of the mudslides last summer, folks will recall that it wasn't clear that we would be able to get the road even temporarily opened quickly. And basically, there was an immediate tranche of funding that came from the federal government, enabled us to do a quick fix while we started the longer term fix to the road, which was completed around the holidays. That said, the next need was to clear the significant amount of debris out of the river, because had we left it there, come spring runoff, there would have almost inevitably been very significant flooding. So, working again with partners at the Federal Highway Administration, this was the first time that we know of that the Federal Highway Administration has paid for a river cleanup. So a lot of sort of precedent setting, expansion of responsibilities here, and CDOT worked with our partner agencies to sort of determine the scope of the project, and then we implemented the contracts for the river cleanup. So what that has meant was removing or sort of changing the shape of 6 very large piles of sediment that had built up in the river. If you've been there, you've seen it. It has been an all hands on deck effort with 2 different contractors. A fun fact is that one of the contractors enlisted a rafting company as a subcontractor to actually move equipment across the river. It's been that broad how involved different areas of expertise have been, and the goal was to get it done before spring runoff. And as of about a day ago, we're on track to be done this week. So it's a big deal to have hit that goal. And it doesn't fix everything, but it means that one very major risk that we faced for this spring and summer is under control. At the same time, we've just started yet another resiliency project to kind of take some of the makeshift improvements we did last year, which was basically placing these very heavy sacks to serve as a water barrier, making those permanent. We've been adding catch fences, clearing out, our maintenance forces have done amazing work over the last months, clearing out, culverts across the canyon, because one of the things that happened with the mud flow was that you had, blocked the drainage system. So just everything from the pothole patching to the drainage systems to the major repair of the road to clearing out the river has happened in parallel to be able to get it ready for the summer. It doesn't totally eliminate risk, right? And, the other thing that we've had to do is bring people together. And we had a pretty incredible readiness preparation a few weeks ago. It was actually 2 exercises to bring together all the communities who are part of both the northern and the southern detour routes to talk about how we manage it if it has to close. And, being prepared for the worst and while you do everything you can to minimize the possibilities is sort of what we have to be doing here. And, with that, I saw that there was a question about alternate routes. And, one of the other areas where there's been a lot of progress at CDOT in the last year and really working hand in glove with our local partners is on scoping out how we can make some improvements to Cottonwood Pass in a manner that both Eagle and Garfield County, whose jurisdiction that road is, are comfortable with, so that it's not an interstate, but that it's a safe detour. And this has been something that's eluded folks for years. I mean, almost since Glenwood Canyon opened in 1982, there's been discussions about an alternate route. And the reason it hadn't moved forward was that folks couldn't get to agreement about what the footprint would look like, because there are downsides to hardening a road, right? And because of the collaboration over the last year or so, we're on a very good path to identifying how to make it good enough, but still sensitive to the environment around it. CDOT has received approval from the Transportation Commission to do the survey work to identify where there are right-of-way needs, and it will position us to sort of take the idea and turn it into a project where we can apply for federal funding. And we've actually already put in an earmark request to make some of these fixes at Blue Hill, which is one of the more challenging turns on Cottonwood Pass.
So have you found that sweet spot of what people are willing to accept and what the drivers who are being detoured are demanding? Do we know what that's going to look like?
What it's probably going to look like is keeping it in county jurisdiction. Both Eagle and Garfield County agree that they want it to remain a county road where there's sort of an operating agreement with the state that it gets used as a detour when needed. It will, not all of it is paved right now, so there would be sort of a streamlined paved route that would be big enough for safe access, but not interstate quality. It wouldn't take that route and turn it into another interstate. So I think that is kind of the fine line that we're towing, and the discussions have been very locally driven, as is appropriate given what we're talking about. And I think that, again, using that context-sensitive solutions process has proved invaluable for having this be something that everybody is entering into together.
Thank you. Appreciate all the topics that you all have covered tonight. It's an amazing array of very deep topics throughout Colorado that we will continue to cover, especially the housing issues, and we will have panels on that throughout the rest of this year. Want to thank each of you for being on the panel tonight. Ian Tafoya with Colorado Green Latinos, Commissioner Pogue from Summit County, and Transportation Commissioner Liu. Really appreciate it. Transportation Director Liu, sorry. Thank you for taking the time to explain all these topics, and I'm sure that you will see a lot of our listeners and our readers at forums coming to a town near you in the future. We want to thank our sponsors tonight for helping us out with the program and making it possible at AAA Colorado and at Mustang. And in the interest of returning people to their regularly scheduled program of the NFL draft, we'll end it here. But please, everybody who is listening tonight, thank you for joining us, and keep going to coloradosun.com to keep up on the news. And please subscribe to the Temperature newsletter for climate and health news. And again, thank you to our panelists. Appreciate everybody being with us tonight.